The senior loan manager at Lockwood Mercantile Bank slammed the foreclosure notice down on the desk so hard that the ink jar rattled against the wood. "File it," Harold Kress said, not even looking up from the ledger in front of him. "All three of them. Keene, Albright, and the widow Farrow. End of the month." The young clerk hesitated. "Sir, two of those families have children. The Keene man lost his wife last spring. His youngest isn't even 7 yet." Harold finally looked up. His eyes were flat, bored. The way a man looks at a fly he's decided to swat. "I didn't ask for a census report," he said. "I asked you to file the paperwork. Do it before I find someone who will." The clerk filed the paperwork. "If this story already has you gripping your seat, you are exactly where we want you. Hit that subscribe button right now and join thousands of viewers who never miss a single episode from this channel. Drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now, stay with us, because what happens next on that mountain is going to break your heart wide open. The blizzard arrived the way Montana blizzards always did in the winter of 1887, without much warning and without any apology. 1 hour the sky was the color of old pewter, pressed low and heavy over the peaks of the Grizzly Crown Range. The next hour the world disappeared. Snow came sideways. Wind punched through the gaps in cabin walls like it had a personal grievance against anything warm. Temperatures dropped 20 degrees in the time it took a man to walk from his barn to his front door, and the passes through the mountains, those narrow, treacherous threads of frozen road that connected the remote ranching families of the territory to the town of Copper Hollow, became something no sane person would attempt. Genevieve Lockwood had attempted it anyway. She was 34 years old, and she was the kind of woman who had been told her entire life what she could not do. Could not inherit a bank, could not run it without a husband, could not negotiate with ranchers and miners who would never respect a woman's signature on a loan document, could not sit at the head of a table full of lawyers and walk away with the better deal. She had done all of those things. She had done them without flinching, and she had done them well enough that Lockwood Mercantile Bank had tripled its deposits in 6 years, and now held paper on half the productive land in the territory. So when the storm warnings came, and her driver urged her to delay the trip back from the northern ranching families until the weather broke, Genevieve told him the same thing she told everyone who tried to protect her from the world. "I'll manage." Those were the last words anyone in Copper Hollow heard her say. The carriage had crossed Grizzly Crown Pass on the eastern route, the longer road but the more sheltered one. 2 horses. An experienced driver named Bart Hollis who had worked the mountain roads for 20 years. A trunk full of loan documents, signed by 9 desperate ranching families who were counting on Genevieve to deliver their emergency financing before the next payment deadline. Somewhere in the dark and the blowing snow, something went wrong. The official search found what the blizzard left behind. 1 horse dead at the base of a rock formation, a carriage wheel half buried in the drift, and Genevieve's traveling trunk thrown 20 yards from the road and frozen into the snowpack like it had been there for years. Bart Hollis's coat was found near the tree line. Bart Hollis was not inside it. The sheriff, a practical man named Duggan, who had lived through 17 Montana winters, called off the search after 4 days. Another storm was building. His riders were exhausted. The mountains were winning. He stood in front of the crowd that had gathered outside the bank and told them the truth as he understood it. "Nobody survives 4 days out there in those conditions," he said. "I'm sorry," Copper Hollow mourned, or pretended to. There were citizens who had genuinely respected Genevieve Lockwood, who had admired the way she ran that bank, who had borrowed money from her at fair terms and paid it back with something resembling gratitude. And there were others, the ones whose loan applications she had denied, the ones who resented a woman sitting behind that desk with that kind of authority, who mourned mostly for appearances, and then got on with the business of wondering what would happen to the bank now. The reward notice came down from the post office wall. The search ended, and the territory moved on. 22 miles from Copper Hollow, in a hollow between 2 foothills that nobody with any other options would have chosen to build a ranch, Ransom Keene was trying to keep 3 children alive on a cattle operation that was failing in every way a cattle operation could fail. He was 38 years old and looked closer to 45. His face was the kind of face that Montana put on men who worked outdoors for 20 years, weathered in a way that was not attractive but was honest. A jaw that had been broken once and healed slightly wrong. Hands with knuckles permanently swollen from cold and labor. eyes that were a plain, unremarkable gray, but had the habit of watching everything carefully, the way men watch things when they've learned that not paying attention costs them. His wife, Clara, had died 11 months ago of a fever that started as something ordinary and became something else so fast that by the time Ransom understood what was happening, there was nothing left to do but hold her hand and talk to her until she couldn't hear him anymore. She had been 31 years old. She had been, in every way that mattered, the person who held the ranch together, the one who kept the accounts, kept the children fed, kept Ransom from making the expensive mistakes that pride and stubbornness made tempting. Without her, everything was harder. Everything cost more than it used to, and not just in money. Caleb was 12, old enough to carry weight, but not old enough for it to be fair that he had to. He was a serious boy, with Clara's dark eyes and Ransom's jaw, and he had taken on his mother's death with a quietness that worried Ransom more than crying would have. Caleb didn't break things. He just became very, very still, and then he got up the next morning and helped without being asked. And Ransom didn't know whether to be proud of that or heartbroken by it. Millie was 9. She missed her mother in loud, sudden, inconvenient ways, bursting into tears in the middle of supper, asking questions Clara was no longer there to answer, climbing into Ransom's lap at night, even though she was getting too big for it, and staying there until she fell asleep, because she wasn't ready to be alone in the dark yet. Ransom never made her move. Jonah was 6, and Jonah was the one Ransom worried about the most, because Jonah remembered Clara the least clearly and was starting to forget things: the sound of her voice, the way she smelled, small details, and he would ask Ransom to describe her, and Ransom would describe her. And then Jonah would fall quiet in a way that was too serious for a 6-year-old and ask, "Papa, will I forget her all the way?" Ransom always told him no. He didn't know if it was true. The cattle were down to 31 head, and 2 of them had wandered off 3 days ago in a minor storm that shouldn't have been enough to lose animals, but was, because the fence line on the eastern pasture had been needing repair since September, and Ransom hadn't had the money for wire. He'd planned to get to it. Then something else needed the money. Then something else needed his time. Now he had 2 missing cattle in the middle of a full blizzard, and without those 2 animals, the spring count wasn't going to be enough to cover the loan payment to Lockwood Bank. He knew about the foreclosure notice. His neighbor Albright had warned him 2 weeks ago. Albright had gotten one, and he'd heard Ransom was next. Ransom had gone to the bank and waited 3 hours and been told by a clerk that the manager wasn't available and maybe he could come back next week. He'd gone back next week. The manager still wasn't available. He'd written a letter. No one had answered it. So he did what he'd been doing since Clara died, which was keep moving and not think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead in his current situation was the kind of thing that could break a man if he let it. The morning after the worst of the blizzard passed, he pulled on every layer he owned, got the children dressed in everything they had, and told them they were going to find those 2 cattle before the next storm came in. "All of us?" Millie asked. "All of us, even Jonah?" Jonah straightened up immediately. "I'm not even cold." Caleb looked outside at the blinding white and said nothing. He went and got his coat. They walked the fence line first, heading east along the hill that backed their property, calling out into the silence the way you call for cattle that are never going to call back. The cold was the kind that gets inside your collar and stays there no matter how you pull your coat. It wasn't snowing, but the wind was moving the snow that was already on the ground, lifting it in long white sheets that cut visibility to 50 yards. Jonah walked between Caleb and Millie because Ransom had told him to, and because, though Jonah would not have admitted this, the drifts on either side of the trail were taller than his chest, and the idea of falling into one was not entirely appealing. They'd been walking for 40 minutes when Caleb stopped. "Papa." Ransom turned. Caleb wasn't pointing at the cattle. He was pointing at something tangled in the lower branches of a cedar tree, about 30 yards off the trail, a strip of fabric, maybe 8 inches wide, bright green and completely wrong against the gray and white of the winter hillside. Ransom went to it. He pulled it loose. It was expensive material, the kind of thick wool that cost real money, with a sewn hem along one edge. Not work clothing. Not anything that belonged to anyone who lived on this side of the mountain. "Where'd that come from?" Millie asked. "Don't know yet," Ransom said. He stood and looked uphill. The wind had scoured the snow into odd shapes, along the higher ground, drifts and hollows that shouldn't have been where they were, channels where the storm had moved things around. The road's back that way, Caleb said, meaning the main pass road. 5 miles at least. More I know. The sheriff searched the road. I know that too. Jonah was looking at the fabric in his father's hand. Is somebody lost up there? Ransom looked at his youngest son for a moment. Then he looked at the hillside. Then he made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know that yet, and wouldn't know it for several hours. We're going to walk uphill a ways, he said. See what the storm moved. What about the cattle? Caleb asked. Cattle can wait. It was Caleb who found the buckle. It was half buried in the snow near a frozen creek, a brass carriage buckle, the kind used on the harnesses of fine horses, cracked clean through the middle, but still attached to a 6-inch length of leather strap. Caleb pulled it out and held it up and didn't say anything for a moment. That's from a carriage, he finally said. Yep. From the road, you mean? The storm must have. Buckles don't travel 5 miles by themselves, Ransom said. Even in a bad storm. The whole rig must have come off the road somewhere higher up and come down through the gully. He looked at the creek bank, at the way the snow had drifted deep against the slope on the far side. Carriage might be buried under that. Is someone in it? Millie asked. Her voice had gone careful. Ransom didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was he didn't know, and the more he looked at the terrain and thought about what the storm had been capable of, the more he thought that whatever answer he gave was going to be wrong in one direction or another. We're going to keep looking, he said. Millie had spotted something else while they were talking, a depression in the snow near a rock outcropping, almost completely filled in by blowing snow but shaped wrong, too regular, like a heel print that the wind had tried to erase and hadn't quite managed. She showed Ransom. He crouched down and looked at it for a long time. Someone walked through here, he said, before the last blow. Walking where? Caleb asked. Ransom straightened and followed the line that the footprints, if that's what they were, seemed to be tracing. They curved away from the creek bed and climbed the hillside to the northeast, toward the steeper terrain where the wind had done less damage to the snow's surface. And then they all heard it. Jonah heard it first, because Jonah had always had the best ears in the family, the kind of hearing that used to make Clara laugh because he could hear a horse on the road 10 minutes before anyone else could. He grabbed Ransom's sleeve and said, Papa, listen. They all stopped moving. The wind was low for a moment, one of those brief pauses that Montana winter gives you sometimes, just long enough to make you believe in something better before it comes back. 3 sounds, dull, rhythmic, too even to be settling snow or cracking ice. Knock, 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 faint, coming from above and to the right. Jonah looked up at his father with his eyebrows pushed together. Someone's knocking, yeah, Ransom said quietly. They are. He started moving. The line shack had been built 40 years ago by a trapper nobody remembered and used by ranchers since then as an emergency shelter during roundups and bad weather. It was small, barely 10 feet by 12, and built with the kind of rough competence that meant it was still standing after 4 decades, but would never be described as comfortable. One window boarded over, a door that hung slightly crooked on its hinges, a stone fire pit in the center of the floor. The storm had buried it. The snowdrift that had come down off the upper slope covered the south wall completely and pressed against the roof on the east side. The only reason any of it was visible at all was a corner of the chimney stack sticking up through the white, and a section of the door frame that the drift hadn't quite reached. Ransom grabbed the door frame and pulled. The door didn't move. Snow had packed against it from the inside. "Help me," he said to Caleb. The two of them pulled together. The door broke open with a sound like a rifle shot, and a small fall of snow came down from the frame above it, and then the smell hit them, cold ash, melted snow, and underneath that, faint and barely there, the smell of a fire that had burned for days and finally gone out. Ransom went in first. The interior was dark except for the pale light coming through the open door. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, and when they did, he saw the shape in the corner wrapped in what had once been a blanket and was now a frozen tangle of wool, pressed against the wall, with knees pulled up, and one hand still holding the piece of wood she'd been using to knock against the wall boards. She was alive. He could see her breath. Small, shallow, not much of it, but there. "Ma'am," Ransom said. He moved to her side and crouched down. "Hey, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes opened. They were green, startling in the dim light, and they focused on him with an effort that was visible, like she had to drag herself back from somewhere distant to make them work. "I heard children," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Cracked and dry outside. I thought I was dreaming." You weren't dreaming. I've got 3 of them out there. Ransom put his hand against her face. She was cold, not the lethal cold of someone whose body had given up, but close enough to it that his stomach dropped. How long have you been in here? I don't know. She blinked. 4 days? 5 since the first storm. Is that what it was? It wasn't a question. She said it like someone confirming something they'd already suspected. The carriage went off the road. I don't know exactly where. It was dark and the snow was coming sideways, and then we were falling. She stopped, swallowed. Bart, my driver, he went for help. Ransom kept his face careful. He didn't know what had happened to Bart Hollis, but he knew a coat had been found at the tree line, and he knew the temperature had been 30 below on the 3rd night, and he knew enough about Montana winters to understand what those 2 facts probably added up to. We'll look for him, he said. First, let's get you warm. He pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around her. Then he turned to the doorway where all 3 of his children were standing and watching, with the particular wide-eyed stillness of children who understand that something serious is happening and have enough sense not to make it worse. Caleb. Wood, as much as you can find. He looked at Millie. You know where the extra blanket is in my pack. Get it. He looked at Jonah. Stay inside and stay close to this woman. Don't let her go back to sleep. Jonah came and crouched down directly in front of the woman, about 8 inches from her face, the way 6-year-olds sometimes do when they have no concept of personal space and also aren't worried about it. He looked at her very seriously. I'm Jonah, he said. The woman blinked at him. Despite everything, something at the corner of her mouth moved in a direction that might eventually become a smile. I'm Genevieve, she said. You look really cold, Jonah said. I'm really cold. I have a piece of dried apple, he said. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small withered piece of apple, the kind of thing a ranch child carries as a special treat and guards carefully. He held it out to her. Genevieve looked at it. Then she looked at this small, serious boy holding out the most valuable thing he had to a stranger he'd known for 30 seconds. Thank you, she said. And she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the apple itself. Caleb built the fire faster than Ransom would have believed possible for a 12-year-old, working with the methodical calm that had become his way of operating since his mother died. No wasted motion, no panic, just the next task and then the task after that. He found wood outside under the snowdrift along the shack's north wall, where the earlier occupant had stacked it, and the drift had preserved it better than anything else. Dry enough to catch. Within 20 minutes, there was a fire. Within 30 minutes, Genevieve had stopped shaking. While the shack warmed up, Ransom got the full story from her in pieces. She told it the way very tired people tell things, circling back, losing threads, starting over. The carriage had come off the road in the dark about a mile above where they'd found the buckle. She had been thrown clear when the rig rolled. Her ankle had caught on something during the fall. She didn't know exactly what, but she couldn't put weight on it, and the pain when she tried was the kind of pain that told you clearly to stop trying. She'd found the shack by following the slope, pulling herself through the snow on her hands, because walking wasn't an option. She'd broken pieces off the furniture for fuel. She'd had 2 biscuits in her coat pocket from the previous day's travel, and rationed them over 3 days. She'd melted snow in the iron pot for water. Then the furniture had run out, and the fire had died that morning, and she'd started knocking on the wallboards every 20 minutes or so, and hoping for something she didn't entirely believe was going to happen. How did you know to come up here? She asked Ransom. The search, they said they searched for 4 days. They searched the road, Ransom said. Storm moves things, carries things downhill. I followed what it carried. She looked at him for a moment. You're not from the search party. No. Then who are you? Ransom Keene. I run cattle on the south side of this ridge. Something moved across her face. Something complicated that she controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. Keene, she said. You know the name? She looked at the fire. I might, she said carefully. I'm Genevieve Lockwood. The name landed in the small room, the way big names sometimes do, with a weight that was almost physical. Millie looked up from where she was sitting. Caleb's hands went still on the piece of wood he was feeding to the fire. Even Jonah, who didn't know who Genevieve Lockwood was or what her name meant, went quiet because everyone else had. Ransom looked at her for a long moment. His face did not change much. It almost never did. You own the bank, he said. I own the bank. A log shifted in the fire. Somewhere outside, the wind was picking back up. Well, Ransom said, I expect we can talk about that later. Right now, we've got a bigger problem. What's that? He nodded toward the roof, where the sound of the wind had changed, deepened, steadied, become the unmistakable low roar of a returning storm. That's the second one they were warning about. It's coming faster than they predicted. He looked at the window. We're not going anywhere until it passes. Genevieve closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. How long? Could be tonight. Could be 2 days, he said it plainly, without apology. This shack is going to have to hold. And if it doesn't? Ransom looked at his 3 children, at Caleb, watching the fire with Clara's patient eyes, at Millie pulling the blanket tighter around herself, at Jonah, who had fallen asleep against Genevieve's arm at some point in the last 10 minutes, his piece of dried apple still in his hand. It'll hold, Ransom said. I'll make sure of it. He spent the next 2 hours doing things Clara would have recognized, the specific, unglamorous work of survival that nobody ever tells stories about because there's nothing dramatic about it. He packed snow against the base of the door to cut the draft. He found a way to prop the shack's single support beam where it had shifted slightly and might not hold another load from the roof. He checked the chimney draw, found a blockage from a bird's old nest, cleared it with a stick so the smoke didn't back up and suffocate them. Genevieve watched him work. She had spent her professional life evaluating people, their character, their reliability, their honesty, the gap between what they said and what they did. It was a skill her father had taught her, and she had honed over 6 years of running an institution that could be ruined by a single wrong trust. She watched Ransom Keene move around the shack, and she made her assessments the way she always did, quietly and without announcing them. He didn't talk while he worked, except to his children. He checked on Millie twice without her asking, both times in ways that looked casual, handing her something, adjusting the blanket, but were clearly intentional. He asked Caleb once if he was warm enough, and when Caleb said yes, Ransom looked at him for an extra second, as if checking whether yes was the truth, and then he seemed to believe it and moved on. He let Jonah sleep. He didn't look at Genevieve with the expression she was used to from men who found themselves in the presence of something they wanted. He looked at her the way he looked at his children, with attention and without performance. When he finally sat down near the fire and let himself rest for a minute, she said, "You didn't have to go uphill." "You were looking for cattle." "Yeah, you could have kept looking for your cattle." He looked at the fire. "No," he said, "I really couldn't have." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because my kids were with me," he said. "And some things you don't do in front of your children." Genevieve didn't say anything to that. Outside, the second blizzard arrived in earnest, and the wind hit the shack walls like something angry, and the 5 of them moved closer to the fire and waited for morning. Somewhere around midnight, Millie woke up and couldn't get back to sleep. She sat up and looked around the shack, her father asleep against the wall, with Jonah bundled against his side, Caleb stretched out near the fire. The woman, Genevieve, was awake too, sitting up with her injured ankle stretched out in front of her, watching the fire. Millie crawled over and sat beside her. "Does it hurt bad?" she asked, nodding at the ankle. "Some," Genevieve said. "Mama broke her wrist once," Millie said. She said it hurt the most when it was getting better. Like it had to hurt more before it could hurt less. Genevieve looked at the girl. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. Millie was quiet for a moment. She died. Back in the spring. "I'm sorry. Papa doesn't talk about it much. He thinks that's better for us, I think." Millie tilted her head. "Is it better not to talk about things?" Genevieve thought about that seriously, the way the question deserved. "I think," she said finally, "that not talking about something doesn't make it go away. But sometimes people don't know how to carry the sad things out loud yet, so they carry them quietly until they can." Millie thought about this. "Is that what you do sometimes? What do you do that's sad?" Genevieve was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. "I had to become very hard to keep things I cared about," she finally said. "And sometimes I think I forgot to stay soft about the things that mattered more." Millie didn't fully understand that, but she nodded as though she did. Then she leaned slightly against Genevieve's arm, just barely testing, the way children test, and when Genevieve didn't move away, Millie stayed there, and eventually fell asleep like that. Genevieve sat awake in the small hours of that Montana night, listening to a blizzard try to bury them all, and thought about the foreclosure notice that her bank had sent to a man named Ransom Keene, whose wife had died in the spring, and who had come up a mountain to find her, because some things you don't do in front of your children. The fire burned low. She didn't sleep. In the morning, the shack was still standing. Barely. The sound that woke everyone was a long, grinding crack from the roof, the kind of sound a structure makes when it's deciding whether it can hold on any longer. Snow had come down off the upper slope during the night and piled against the east wall, and the weight of it was doing something to the roof beam that was not going to improve with time. Ransom was on his feet before the sound finished. He pressed his hand against the east wall, felt the flex in it, looked up at the roof and at the beam he'd braced the night before. "We have to go," he said. "Right now. Get your things. The storm Caleb started has broken enough. Wind's down. We have maybe a few hours before the next one goes in." He was already moving, helping Genevieve to her feet. "Can you ride?" "I can manage. You'll have to manage on a horse. I'm not carrying you down this slope." He said it matter-of-factly, without cruelty, and she heard the respect in it, the assumption that she could handle the truth of her situation. "I'll manage," she said again, and this time she meant it differently. They packed what little there was to pack the blanket, the remaining handful of dried meat from Ransom's saddlebag, a tin cup. Ransom rigged a sling from the broken harness leather he'd noticed, hanging on the shack wall the previous night, working it into something that would support Genevieve's weight in the saddle and take pressure off the ankle. He did this quickly and well, and Genevieve watched his hands and thought, "This man is poor, and he is not educated, and he has never sat in a boardroom in his life, and he knew exactly what needed doing here before I finished the sentence." When they stepped outside, the cold hit like a wall, but the sky was lighter than it had been in days, and the wind had dropped enough that they could see the slope below them, the tilted, drifted, treacherous world of Grizzly Crown Pass, and Ransom looked at it the way he looked at everything, carefully and without panicking. "Stay together," he said. "Caleb on the horse. Millie, you're right behind your brother. Jonah, you walk in my tracks and only my tracks, Mrs. Lockwood, Genevieve," she said. He looked at her briefly. "Genevieve, you're on the horse with Caleb. Let him lead. I can lead the horse myself." "I know you can," Ransom said. "Let him lead anyway." Something in the way he said it, not an order, just a statement of what would be best, and a quiet assumption that she was smart enough to recognize it, made her nod. Caleb took the horse's reins, and they started down. The descent from Grizzly Crown Pass was the kind of thing that happens to a person and then stays with them for the rest of their life, not as a memory exactly, but as a sensation that comes back without warning. The particular quality of cold against the face when the wind picks up on an open slope. The sound of a horse's hooves breaking through the crust of ice-hardened snow. The way silence can feel louder than noise when the stakes are high enough that every small sound carries meaning. Caleb led the horse with both hands on the reins and his eyes on the ground in front of him, reading the surface the way Ransom had taught him, looking for the places where the snow was darker, which usually meant ice underneath, avoiding the deep drifts along the left side of the slope where the terrain dropped away into nothing. He was 12 years old, and he was doing a job that required the judgment of a grown man, and he was doing it without being asked twice. Genevieve sat in the saddle with her injured ankle resting free of the stirrup, the harness leather sling taking the weight off it, her hands gripping the saddle horn, not because she couldn't ride without gripping it, but because the horse was moving at an angle across the slope, and the footing was uncertain, and she was not too proud to hold, on when holding on was the intelligent thing to do. She watched the back of this 12-year-old boy's head and thought about what it meant that he was out here, that all three of them were out here, in conditions that most grown men would have refused. Millie walked directly behind the horse, close enough to touch its hind quarters, watching her feet. Jonah walked behind her, stepping exactly in Ransom's tracks the way he'd been told, his small face set with the fierce concentration of a child who has been given one job and intends to do it perfectly. Ransom walked point, 3 yards ahead of Caleb, testing the surface before he committed his weight to it. He had a long stick he'd pulled from the shack's fallen woodpile, a rough, unstripped branch about 5 feet long, and he used it the way a man uses a walking stick on bad terrain, probing ahead, checking depth, reading the mountain. They made it 400 yards down the slope before the first real problem appeared. Ransom stopped. He held up one hand without turning around, and Caleb stopped the horse and everyone stopped behind him. "What is it?" Caleb asked. Ransom didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the slope below them, at the place where the trail curved to the left around a rock formation and disappeared. He'd traveled this ground before years ago, during a summer roundup that had taken cattle up into the high pastures. He knew what was around that curve. The problem was what he heard, or rather, what he didn't hear. The mountain had gone very quiet in the past 30 seconds, the kind of quiet that is not restful, that has a held-breath quality to it. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. The snow on the upper slope, above and to the right of where they stood, had stopped moving. "Stay exactly where you are," he said quietly. "Nobody move." "Ransom," Genevieve said from the saddle. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were on the upper slope, too. "That's—" "Yeah." The avalanche came down not from directly above them, but from the eastern face, a section of the slope that had been loaded with 2 weeks of accumulated snow and had been waiting for exactly the right combination of temperature change and new weight to let go. It hit the trail 50 yards below them with a sound like a freight train hitting a wall, and it crossed the path of their descent in about 4 seconds, and then it was past, and the rumble faded, and there was snow settling and silence. Where the trail had been, there was now a wall of compacted white debris, 8 feet high and 20 yards wide. Nobody spoke for a moment. Jonah had grabbed the back of Millie's coat with both hands. Millie had one hand pressed flat against the horse's side. Caleb was looking at his father. "That was our way home," Caleb said. "Yeah," Ransom said. "So what do we do?" Ransom looked at the debris field. Then he looked right and left along the slope, working out the terrain from what he remembered and what he could see. His expression was the same, as it always was, attentive, unhurried, but Genevieve, watching him from the saddle, noticed that his jaw was set in a way it hadn't been a minute ago. "There's another way," he said. "It's longer and it's harder, but it gets us down." "How much longer?" Genevieve asked. "Couple hours. Maybe 3. She looked at the sky. The lighter area to the southwest that had given them hope at dawn was already shrinking, the gray coming back in from the north. "How long before the next storm hits?" 4 hours. Maybe 5. It was not a comfortable margin. Everyone present understood that. "Then we go," she said. Ransom looked at her for a moment, that brief assessing look, and then he nodded and turned them east along the slope, away from the buried trail, toward the alternate route that only someone who had been on this mountain before would know existed. The horse didn't like the new terrain. It was steeper on the east-facing side, less sheltered from the wind that was beginning to rebuild, and the surface had a different texture, icy in places where the sun had hit and refrozen, soft and treacherous in others where the snow was deep and unsupported. Caleb kept the animal moving with a combination of pressure and talk, the low, steady murmur that he'd learned from Ransom, the voice that said everything is fine, even when everything was clearly not fine, because sometimes the thing an animal needed most was to believe that the person in charge believed it too. "You're good with horses," Genevieve said to him, watching. Caleb glanced up at her briefly. "Papa taught me. He taught you young. He said the sooner you learn to talk to animals, the sooner they'll talk back." Caleb paused. He didn't mean actually talk. He meant the way they move, and how they stand, and what their ears do. "I know what he meant," Genevieve said. Caleb looked at her again. He had his mother's eyes dark and direct, and he used them the way his mother had used them, which was to look at people long enough to see past the surface of what they were presenting. "You know our name," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. Genevieve was quiet for a step or two. "I do, from the bank." "Yes." "Are you going to take our ranch?" The question landed plainly, with no emotion attached to it, which made it worse than if he'd said it with anger. Caleb was 12 years old, and he was asking an honest question, and he deserved an honest answer. And Genevieve understood in that moment that the particular discomfort she felt was not unfamiliar. It was the specific discomfort of being on the wrong side of something and knowing it. "I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen," she said. Caleb looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the ground in front of him. "All right," he said, and kept walking. And the horse kept walking, and the sound of hooves on crusted snow continued, and the wind picked up another degree. Ransom, walking ahead, had not turned around, but his posture had changed slightly. Something in his shoulders, he had heard every word. The frozen river appeared below them, after another hour of descent, and Ransom stopped at the top of the bank and looked at it and felt something cold in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the Grizzly Crown's secondary drainage, not a river exactly, more a wide creek that expanded to 40 feet across in spring, but was now frozen and silent, the ice thick in some places and deceptive in others. He had known it was there. He had not known, until now, that the debris from the avalanche had choked the eastern trail completely, cutting off the way around it. There was no way around it. They were going to have to cross. He went down the bank and stepped out onto the ice and stood there a moment, feeling it with his feet the way you feel ice through the boots, through the body. listening for the sound that wasn't quite a sound, but was closer to a vibration. The deep groan of ice that was carrying more than it wanted to. He walked 10 feet out and stopped. "Well," Genevieve called from the bank. "It'll hold some of us," he said. "How many is some?" He walked back to the bank. "One at a time," he said. "Maybe." He looked at the horse. Not the horse. Not with weight on it. "Can it cross without weight?" "Possibly. But not while we're watching and worrying. It'll spook." He looked at the bank, and at his children, and at the width of the crossing, and he did the arithmetic of risk that a man does when he has no good options, and has to pick the least bad one. "Here's what we're going to do. Caleb, Millie, and Jonah go first. On their stomachs." Millie stared at him. "On our stomachs?" "Spreads the weight out. You stay flat and you crawl and you don't stop for anything. Caleb, you go first." Millie behind him. Jonah behind Millie. "What about the rope?" Caleb asked. Ransom was already pulling the coil of rope from his pack, a 40-foot length he'd brought for exactly the kind of situation you hoped you never encountered. He tied one end around the largest tree on the bank, tested the knot, then tied the other end into a loop and held it out to Caleb. "You take this across. When you get to the other side, you find something to anchor it, a root, a rock, anything solid, and you hold it tight. Then Millie follows the rope. Then Jonah, and then Genevieve." Caleb looked at his father. "And then you." Ransom didn't answer that directly. He said, "The horse will follow on its own once you're all across. They don't like being left behind. Papa Caleb." His voice was quiet, but it was the voice that ended discussions. "Go." Caleb went. He got flat on the ice at the bank's edge and started moving, the rope looped around his wrist, his elbows and knees working in the crawling motion that distributes weight the way Ransom had shown him on the pond behind the barn. When Caleb was 8 years old, and Ransom had made all 3 kids practice ice crossing every winter, because he had grown up in Montana, and he understood that this was the kind of knowledge that one day made the difference between everything and nothing. The ice held. Caleb reached the far bank in 2.5 minutes, moving steadily without stopping, and when he got there, he found a root exposed from an old cottonwood that had partially collapsed over the bank, and he anchored the rope around it and pulled it tight and called back, "Ready." Millie went next. She was lighter than Caleb, and she moved faster than was probably wise, but she made it, and Ransom let his breath out when she reached the far bank, and Caleb grabbed her arm. Jonah. Jonah was 6 years old and small for his age, and he looked at the 40 feet of ice between him and his brother and sister, and he swallowed hard, and he looked up at his father. "I'm scared," he said, which was notable because Jonah almost never admitted to being scared. Ransom crouched down to his son's eye level. "I know. You're allowed to be scared. What if the ice breaks?" "It won't break for you. You're too light." Ransom put his hands on Jonah's small shoulders. "You know how we practiced?" Jonah nodded. "Then you already know how to do this. You just have to do it." Ransom looked into his son's eyes. "When you get to the other side, tell Caleb to hold that rope tight. You understand?" Jonah nodded again. His chin was doing something it did when he was trying very hard not to cry, a small trembling that he was clearly willing by force of will to stop. "I love you, Papa," he said. Ransom's face did something it didn't do often. "I love you too, buddy." "Go." Jonah went flat on the ice. He moved slowly at first, then faster as the rope guided him and his body found the rhythm. He made it across in 3.5 minutes, which felt to everyone watching like 30. When Caleb pulled Jonah to his feet on the far bank, Jonah turned around immediately and shouted across the ice, "Tell Caleb to hold the rope tight," Papa said. "I am holding the rope tight," Caleb said. "Papa said to tell you." Genevieve had been standing at the bank watching all of this, her weight on her good ankle, one hand on the trunk of the anchor tree. She looked at Ransom. "I won't slow down," she said. "I know you won't. My anchor your elbows and your one good leg. Don't try to push with the bad one, just drag it." He held her gaze. "You already crawled through the snow to find that shack. You can do 40 feet of ice." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in the way he said it, not encouragement exactly, not the pumped-up false confidence people offer when they're trying to paper over real danger, but simple recognition. He was treating her the way he treated Caleb, with the expectation of competence. She got down on the ice. She moved. Her elbows found their grip on the rough surface where wind had scoured it. Her good leg pushed, her bad ankle dragged, and she kept her eyes on the rope and nothing else. Not the dark shape of deeper water she could see through a thin section of ice to her left. Not the crack that ran diagonally across the surface 10 feet ahead of her. Not the sounds the ice was making as her weight moved across it. She got to the crack. It was 2 inches wide. She went across it without stopping. When Caleb grabbed her arm on the far bank, she was shaking, but not from cold. "Good," Ransom called from the other side. "Now you," she called back. The horse crossed on its own, exactly as Ransom said it would, following the sound of the children's voices, stepping carefully, pausing once in the middle, and then continuing when Caleb called to it. It made the bank without breaking through. Ransom untied the rope from the tree on his side and coiled it and went flat on the ice and started across. He was heavier than any of them. He knew it. He moved carefully, taking his time, feeling the ice through every inch of his body, reading it. He was 20 feet out when he heard the sound that was not quite a sound, the deep structural complaint of ice that was making a decision. He moved faster. He was at the crack when it went. Not all of it, just a section 3 feet wide directly behind him. The edge of the crack he had just crossed, the weakest point that had been waiting for his weight to pass it. The sound was sharp and final, and the water came up black and immediate, and Ransom's back half went through. The cold hit like something alive. He had the rope. One end was around his wrist, and the other was, he didn't know where the other was, because everything was happening very fast, and the water was pulling, and the ice was crumbling at the edges of the hole, and he got his chest onto the solid surface ahead of him, and clawed at it with his hands, trying to find purchase. On the far bank, Caleb did not hesitate. He threw the rope's loose end to Genevieve and Millie and grabbed the taut middle section himself and pulled, and Genevieve was already on her knees at the bank's edge, hauling on the rope with both hands and ignoring everything else. And Millie pulled beside her, and Jonah grabbed the rope too, though he was too small to do much, but he grabbed it and he pulled with everything he had. Ransom got his chest further onto the solid ice. His legs were still in the water, and the cold was the kind of cold that was already taking his coordination away, the specific theft of function that freezing water does to the body in the first 2 minutes. He crawled. The rope pulled. He crawled and the rope pulled and the ice held, and he got one knee onto solid surface, and then the other, and then he was moving, soaking and shaking, toward the bank. And Caleb and Genevieve were pulling, and then he was on solid ground, and the water was behind him. He lay on the bank for approximately 5 seconds. Then he pushed himself up to sitting. He was completely soaked from the waist down. His pants were already starting to stiffen in the cold. Genevieve was looking at him. Her face had done something in the last 30 seconds that she wasn't able to control, gone pale, and then sharp with something raw and functional, the face of a person who has just been frightened in a real way and is working through it. "Are you?" she started. "Fine," he said. His voice was only slightly unsteady. "You are not fine, you're soaked." "What's the temperature?" "Cold enough." He was already getting up. "We have to keep moving." "Wet clothes and standing cold, you know what that does." "I know what that does," she said, and she stood too. And she said, "Give me your coat." He stopped. "What?" "You're soaked through. You need insulation on the outside of the wet layer, not just the wet layer." "Give me your coat." "I'll walk. The movement will keep me warm enough." He looked at her. "I'm not asking," she said. He gave her the coat. She put it around him over his wet jacket, and he didn't say thank you, but he didn't argue either, and they started walking. The last 2 miles to Copper Hollow were the kind of miles that people survive rather than travel. Ransom walked with Jonah pressed against his side for warmth that worked in both directions. Genevieve walked with the careful, slightly off-rhythm gait of someone working around pain, but refusing to be stopped by it. Millie walked beside the horse, talking to it quietly in the way Caleb had talked to it on the descent, a steady low murmur that was mostly for her own benefit. Caleb walked point. The sky was doing something complicated and ominous to the north. The 4-hour window Ransom had estimated was closing. They didn't speak much. They had passed the part of the day where there was anything useful to say, and what was left was just movement 1 foot in front of the other, the math of distance and time and body temperature, the specific determination of people who have decided they are not going to stop until they don't have to stop anymore. Somewhere in the last half mile, Jonah slipped on a patch of ice and went down hard on one knee and let out a sound that was partly pain and partly just the accumulated weight of the whole day, coming out in the only direction it could. He didn't cry exactly. He made the sound and then pressed his lips together and tried to get up. Ransom picked him up without breaking stride. He settled Jonah against his left side, one arm under the boy's knees, and kept walking. Jonah put his head against his father's shoulder. Genevieve watched this and looked away. The town appeared through the gray, like something you're not sure is real until you're close enough to see the details: the smoke from chimneys, the dark angles of rooftops against the sky, the lights in windows that meant warmth and people, and the end of this particular ordeal. They came out of the foothills onto the edge of the main road into Copper Hollow at approximately 3 in the afternoon. And the first person who saw them was old Hester Crane, who ran the dry goods store and who was standing on her porch watching the storm build when she looked right and saw 5 figures coming down from the mountain, one of them on a horse that she recognized as the Keene family's old gray, and one of them walking with a limp, and one of them being carried. She stared for a moment. Then she walked back inside and came out with her husband and said, "Look." He looked. "Is that?" he started. "I think so," she said. By the time Ransom and Genevieve and the children reached the edge of town, there were a dozen people on the street watching them come in. Then more. The word moved through Copper Hollow the way words move in small towns, faster than a horse, louder than it needs to be, in every direction at once. Genevieve Lockwood, alive, coming down off Grizzly Crown in the company of the poorest cowboy family in the valley. Sheriff Duggan pushed through the crowd that had gathered at the edge of the main street. He stopped in front of them and looked at Genevieve, at her face, her ankle, her borrowed coat, and then he looked at Ransom, who was still carrying Jonah and was still soaking wet from the waist down, and had the look of a man who would like very much to sit down somewhere warm and is not going to say so. "Mrs. Lockwood," Duggan said. He took his hat off. "Old habit, Sheriff," Genevieve said. We searched. 4 days. We thought—" "I know what you thought." Her voice was even. Not angry. Just tired, and something underneath the tired that was more complicated. The storm carried the carriage further than the road. Off the eastern side, she paused. "Bart, my driver." "Was he—" Duggan looked at her. He had the decency not to avoid her eyes. "We found his coat. Nothing else." Genevieve absorbed this without expression. The expression came later, alone, and that was her own business. "I see." The crowd was pressing in, people calling her name, several of the bank's board members pushing toward her with the look of men who have spent a week thinking about institutional uncertainty and are very relieved to see it resolved. Someone had gone for the doctor. Someone else had gone for a carriage. Genevieve ignored all of it for a moment. She turned to Ransom. He was standing slightly apart from the crowd, which was natural, and also somewhat inevitable. This was not his world, this gathering of merchants and officials and well-dressed townspeople, and he stood in it with the self-possession of a man who is comfortable being on the outside of things. Jonah was still against his shoulder, half asleep now. "Mr. Keene," Genevieve said. Ransom looked at her. "There's a reward," she said. "The bank offered." "I know about the reward," he said. "Then you know it's considerable." "I do." And he shifted Jonah's weight slightly, looked at the boy's sleeping face for a moment, then back at her. "My feed supply got used up searching for you," he said. "And my kids went through their winter ration of dried stores. That needs replacing." He paused. "That's all I want." Genevieve stared at him. Around them, the crowd was making noise, questions, exclamations, the full spectrum of small-town reaction to the return of a person they'd given up on. None of it registered. "That's not close to what the reward offers," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't. You found me. You kept me alive. You brought me off a mountain in a blizzard with 3 children and a lame horse, and you went into a freezing river and your children." She stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't intended. She steadied it. "Mr. Keene." Why, he thought about it for a moment. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was working out whether this was a conversation he wanted to have on a public street with half of Copper Hollow listening. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I have 3 kids watching me." He said it the same way he'd said it up on the mountain when she'd asked the same question, and the repetition was not accidental. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get these children somewhere warm." He turned and walked toward the edge of the crowd, and the people parted for him the way people part for someone who has clearly earned the right to walk through, and Caleb and Millie fell in behind him, and they disappeared from the main street in the direction of the livery stable, where they'd need to see to the horse before anything else, because that was who Ransom Keene was. Genevieve stood in the street and watched him go. Dr. Mercer arrived at her elbow and began talking about her ankle and the need for warmth and rest. Board member Aldrich arrived at her other elbow and began talking about the bank and several pressing matters that had apparently arisen during her absence and required immediate attention. She let them talk. Her eyes were still on the space where Ransom Keene had been. The ankle was broken in one place and badly sprained in two others, which the doctor explained was something of a small fortune relative to what it could have been, given the conditions and the duration. He wrapped it and gave her something for the pain, and told her she would need to stay off it for 6 weeks, which she acknowledged and then immediately decided was approximate. They put her up in the hotel. Her house was 2 miles outside of town, and she was in no condition to travel there, and the hotel proprietor gave her the best room and a fire that someone built up to a level that bordered on extravagant. And clean clothes were sent over from the mercantile, and hot food came up on a tray, and people came and went all evening wanting to see her and be seen seeing her. And through all of it, Genevieve sat in the chair nearest the fire and answered their questions and accepted their relief and thought about something else. She thought about Harold Kress. She'd been thinking about him since the moment on the mountain when Caleb had asked her, flat and direct, if the bank was going to take their ranch. She'd said no, and she'd meant it. But the fact that it was a question he had to ask at all, that a 12-year-old boy walking his father across a frozen mountain already knew what the bank had intended for his family, sat inside her like something with weight. Harold Kress was her senior loan manager. She'd hired him 3 years ago from a bank in Helena, bringing him in for his record of portfolio growth and his reputation for efficiency. She'd been focused on growth then, on expanding the bank's reach into the Northern Territories, on building the kind of institutional strength that would outlast her own involvement if something happened. Harold had delivered. The numbers in his division were consistently strong. She had not asked closely enough what was behind the numbers. She had not asked because she had trusted her hire and her structure and her instincts. And she had been wrong. And a family that had kept her alive was going to lose their home as a result of her inattention. She picked up the hot cup of tea someone had left on the table and held it and looked at the fire. Then she asked the hotel proprietor's boy to find her a pen and paper, and she wrote 2 notes. One was to Harold Kress, instructing him to put a hold on all active foreclosure proceedings and present her with a full accounting of every property action his division had taken in the past 18 months. The second note was to the sheriff, asking him to make himself available the following morning. She sealed them both and sent the boy to deliver them. Outside, the second blizzard arrived. It hit Copper Hollow with the kind of force that made the windows in the hotel rattle in their frames, and the fire flared and settled, and the wind worked itself into every gap in the building. Up on the mountain, 5 hours earlier, that wind had been trying to kill her. Down here, in this warm room, it was just weather. The difference, she understood now in a way she hadn't understood before, was not something that money had made. It was something a poor cowboy and his children had made, with rope and firewood and dried apple, and the specific, uncomplicated conviction that the right thing was worth doing, regardless of who you were or what it cost. She sat by the fire for a long time after the candles burned low, not sleeping, thinking about what was owed and what was right, and what kind of bank, what kind of person she intended to be when the storm was over. The morning after the blizzard, Copper Hollow looked the way it always looked after a bad storm scraped clean and exhausted. The streets empty, except for the men with shovels, working the boardwalks and the smoke from every chimney going straight up in the dead air that follows hard weather. The sky had turned the specific shade of pale blue that meant the storm was finished and the cold was serious, the kind of cold that had opinions about exposed skin and enforced them quickly. Genevieve was already at the desk in her hotel room when the sun came up, her bandaged ankle propped on the footstool the doctor had left. A cup of coffee going cold at her elbow because she kept forgetting to drink it. She had the hotel's writing paper spread in front of her, and she had been writing since before dawn, not correspondence, not bank business, but a list. Names of properties, dates of foreclosure notices, amounts owed against amounts that had been seized. The numbers she had memorized from years of running the institution, combined with the numbers Harold Kress had sent over that morning in a response to her note that was professionally worded and told her almost nothing, which told her almost everything. Sheriff Duggan arrived at 8 o'clock. He was a careful man, not the kind of careful that was cautious, but the kind that was methodical, that gathered information before it spoke, that understood the difference between what people said and what the record showed. He had served as sheriff of Copper Hollow for 11 years. He knew the county. He knew its people. And when Genevieve laid out what she'd been thinking since the mountain, he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You're telling me Cress has been running this scheme for how long?" he said. "At minimum 18 months, Genevieve said. Possibly longer. The pattern in the numbers goes back further, but the acceleration starts 18 months ago. That's when the cattle company out of Billings started acquiring parcels in this county. Hartwell Cattle. You know them. I know their acquisition agent. Comes through twice a year with a lot of cash money and a lot of good manners." Duggan's voice had gone flat in a particular way. "Never asked too many questions about where the parcels came from." "I need the records," Genevieve said. "All of them. Every property transaction in the county for the past 2 years. And I need someone who understands land law." "I can get you the records," Duggan said. "The land lawyer's going to be a problem. We've got one in town, and Hartwell Cattle is his best client." Genevieve picked up her cold coffee, drank some of it. "Then we'll need to bring someone in from Helena." Duggan looked at her. He was a man who had seen a lot of things that surprised him in 11 years of law work, and he had developed the expression of a person who no longer showed surprise easily. But something in his face moved. "Mrs. Lockwood," he said, "you understand what you're describing. If this is what you think it is, Cress didn't do it alone. He had help inside the bank, and he had help outside it, and some of those people are going to have considerable interest in making sure it stays buried." "I know that," she said, "and you still want to pull on this thread." She set the coffee cup down. "Those families lost their properties because someone in my institution manipulated the process. My name is on that building. My father's name. Whatever Cress did, it happened because I wasn't watching closely enough." She looked at Duggan directly. "I'm watching now." He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once and stood up and put his hat back on. "I'll get you the records," he said. "Give me 2 days." After he left, Genevieve sat alone in the hotel room and looked at her list of names and thought about one name in particular that was not a property record or a transaction, a name that was the reason she understood, more personally than any ledger could convey, what this scheme had cost. Ransom Keene. She needed to see him. Getting to the Keene ranch required a carriage she wasn't supposed to be in, and a road that wasn't entirely cleared, and an ankle that the doctor had specifically said should not bear weight for 6 weeks. She did it anyway. 2 days after returning to town, sitting in the carriage with her leg up on the opposite seat and her jaw set in the expression that her Stesef had learned meant she had made a decision, and the conversation about whether it was wise had already happened in her own head and concluded. The Keene property looked different in daylight than it had seemed from the pieces Caleb had described on the mountain. It was small, the main house, and a barn and a secondary structure that might have been a smokehouse once and was now storing something else, all of it sitting in the hollow between the foothills, with the practical, no-wasted space arrangement of a working operation that had never had money to spare for anything aesthetic. The fence line along the road was partially repaired with wire that didn't match the older sections, new work spliced into old recent work, done by someone who knew what they were doing, but was working with the materials they had. Ransom came out of the barn when the carriage stopped. He had a hammer in one hand and a look on his face that said he'd been in the middle of something and was mildly annoyed at the interruption. And then he saw who was in the carriage, and the look changed into something more careful. "Mrs. Lockwood," he said. "Mr. Keene." She had the carriage door open before the driver could get around to help her, and she was working on the step down with the ungainly, slightly painful competence of someone who has decided that accepting assistance for every small thing is more trouble than the small thing. Ransom watched this for approximately 1 second, and then came and held out his arm. Not his hand, his arm, the way you offer support to someone who is managing, rather than failing. She took it, got down, found her balance on the good ankle and the short crutch the doctor had given her. "You probably shouldn't be on this road yet," he said. "Probably not." She looked up at him. He was slightly taller than she'd registered. On the mountain, she had been horizontal for most of their acquaintance up there, which changed perspective considerably. "I need to talk to you about the foreclosure." Something shifted in his face. Not wariness exactly, but attention, the close kind. "Come inside," he said. "I've got coffee on." The inside of the Keene house was the inside of a house that a woman had once run, and a man was now running alone. and the difference was visible in the specific ways that only someone paying attention would notice. The practical things were maintained. The stove was clean, the floor was swept, the dishes were stacked. The other things had drifted. A mending pile in the corner that was slightly larger than it should be. A curtain with a hem that had come loose and been pinned rather than sewn. A jar of dried flowers on the windowsill that had been beautiful once and had not been replaced or removed because whoever had put them there was no longer there to do either. Genevieve noticed all of it and said nothing about any of it. Ransom poured 2 cups of coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. He stayed standing, leaning against the counter, which she recognized as the posture of a man who wants to be able to move quickly if this conversation goes in a direction he doesn't want. "The foreclosure is stopped," she said. "You told your manager." "I told my manager to halt all active proceedings. But I want to be direct with you about something." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "It wasn't my manager who stopped it. It was me, personally. And the reason it needed to stop is not just because of what happened on the mountain." Ransom was watching her. "Harold Kress, my senior loan manager, has been running a scheme," she said. "He's been manipulating valuations on struggling properties, inflating fees that weren't owed, filing notices with incorrect dates to shorten the response window, and then selling the seized properties to a cattle company out of billings at prices well below what the land was worth, with, I believe, a personal arrangement on the side." She paused. "Your ranch was on his list. So were 11 others in this county." Ransom put his coffee cup down on the counter. He didn't move for a moment. "How long?" he said. "At least 18 months. Possibly 2 years. And you didn't know." It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't quite not one either. "No," she said. "I didn't know." She said it plainly, without the defensive framing that would have been easy. "I should have been watching more closely. I was focused on expansion, on the Northern Territory accounts, and on the institutional growth side of the business. And I trusted the people I'd put in place to run their divisions correctly. That was my failure." Ransom was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the yard, at the fence line, at the barn. When he looked back at her, his face was the face she'd come to associate with him, everything going on behind it, not much of it visible on the surface. "The Albright family," he said. 2 miles east of me. They got a notice too, I know. They're on my list. They lost their place, Mrs. Lockwood. 3 months ago. Gerald Albright sold the mules to pay what the bank said he owed, and then the bank took the property anyway, said the payment didn't cover the full amount. He said it without raising his voice. He's living with his wife's brother in town. 4 kids. Genevieve had read the Albright file that morning. She had not expected hearing it stated plainly in a kitchen to feel different than reading it in a ledger, but it did. "I know," she said again. "Farrow widow. She's 61 years old, and she'd paid on that land for 23 years, and your bank told her she'd miscalculated her payments going back 5 years and owed the difference plus penalties. I know about the Farrow property. Do you know she's sleeping on her daughter's floor in a 1-room house in Copper Hollow with her daughter's 3 children and her daughter's husband, and no room for any of them to turn around?" "Mr. Keene, I'm not trying to make you feel bad," he said. And he said it without particular emotion, which was somehow more effective than if he'd said it with anger. "I'm telling you what your list of names actually is, so that when you decide how to fix it, you understand what you're fixing." Genevieve looked at him for a long moment. "That's exactly why I came to you," she said. He didn't answer immediately. He picked up his coffee, drank some, set it down again. "What do you need from me?" he said. "I need someone who knows these families," she said. "Who knows the land? Who knows what the properties are actually worth? Who can tell me where the numbers were manipulated versus where they were legitimate? My records have been altered. I can see the alterations in some cases. The pattern is there, if you know what to look for, but I need someone who was there, who watched their neighbors get these notices and knew something was wrong." Ransom was quiet. "I'm also going to need that person to be willing to say what they know in front of a sheriff," she added, "and possibly in front of a judge." He looked at the window again, then back at her. "When do you want to start?" he said. They started that afternoon at the kitchen table, with Ransom's memory and Genevieve's ledger copies spread between them. He knew more than she'd expected, not about banking, but about land and timing and the sequence of events that had surrounded each foreclosure. He knew because, in a community this small and this isolated, neighbors knew each other's troubles. He knew because he had been watching it happen to the people around him, and had not understood what he was watching until she named it. Caleb came home from the barn at some point and stopped in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the table with papers spread between them and said nothing. Millie came in behind him, took one look at Genevieve, and immediately asked if she wanted more coffee in the straightforward way that children ask when they want to be included in something important that's happening in their house. Ransom said yes, get the coffee, and Millie got it with the care of someone performing a task that matters. Jonah arrived last, running from somewhere, stopping when he saw Genevieve with the same full-body pleasure he'd shown on the mountain when she'd told him her name, as if her presence in his house was simply the best possible thing that could have been happening at this moment. "You came," he said. "I came," she agreed. "Is your foot better?" "Getting there." He considered this and then dragged a chair to a position approximately 6 inches from hers and sat in it and looked at the papers on the table with great seriousness. "I'll help," he announced. "Jonah," Ransom said. "I can help," Jonah said with dignity. "I know lots of things." Genevieve glanced at Ransom. Something happened at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, suppressed before it completed. "He can stay," she said, "as long as he's quiet." Jonah was quiet for nearly 4 minutes, which was exceptional. It took 3 days to build the picture clearly enough that Genevieve could see the whole shape of it, and the shape was worse than she'd initially estimated. Cress had not been working alone. He had 2 people inside the bank, a junior clerk named Whitmore, who had been processing the altered documents, and the bank's notary, a man named Phelps, who had been certifying signatures and dates he should not have certified. Outside the bank, the connection to Hartwell Cattle ran through an acquisition agent named Del Stratton, who had been operating out of Billings, and who, Genevieve now believed, had approached Cress originally with the scheme rather than the other way around. 12 properties. 7 had been fully seized and transferred. 4 were in various stages of the foreclosure process, including Ransom's. 1, the Farrow property, had been partially sold before a title dispute with an adjacent landowner had stalled the transaction, which was the only reason the Farrows had any remaining legal claim to the land at all. Genevieve sat across from Duggan in his office on the 4th day and walked him through the documentation she and Ransom had assembled. The sheriff listened with his arms crossed and his face doing the closed, focused thing it did when he was building something in his head. "Stratton's going to be the hard one," Duggan said. "He's out of my jurisdiction." "He comes through here twice a year," Genevieve said. "He's due in the spring. You want me to be ready for him when he comes. I want you to coordinate with the sheriff in Billings before he comes. I want this handled correctly." She paused. "I also want Cress, Whitmore, and Phelps removed from the bank today. That's your business. I can't stop you. I know you can't. I'm telling you as a courtesy so you know the sequence." Duggan studied her. "How is Cress going to react to being removed?" "I imagine poorly. He has friends in town. People who've done business with him." "I know. Some of those people are on the bank's board." Genevieve looked at him steadily. "I know that too." Duggan was quiet for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. "Mrs. Lockwood," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "Go ahead. Did you know about any part of this before the mountain?" The question sat in the room. She understood why he was asking it. It was the question anyone in his position had to ask, the one that separated a wronged employer from a more complicated situation. "No," she said, "I did not." He held her gaze for another moment. Apparently satisfied with what he found there, he nodded. "Then let's go take Cress's keys," he said. Harold Cress's office at Lockwood Mercantile Bank occupied the best corner of the building, a fact Genevieve had approved when she hired him, because she had believed in giving capable people appropriate authority. The office had a large window facing the main street, a heavy mahogany desk that Cress had brought from Helena, and a private door to the side alley that Genevieve was now quite certain had been used for conversations that were never recorded in any ledger. She arrived at the bank at 10 in the morning with Duggan at her side and the full weight of what she'd spent 5 days building. She told her head teller to lock the front doors and keep the staff at their stations. She told Duggan to stand outside Cress's office door. Then she went in. Cress was at his desk. He was a man in his mid-40s, well-dressed in the way of someone who considers appearance part of his professional arsenal: good coat, clean collar, hair that was always slightly too well arranged to be accidental. When Genevieve came through the door, he stood, which was habit, the trained courtesy that cost nothing, and signaled deference while the mind behind it was doing something else. "Mrs. Lockwood," he said, "I wasn't expecting should I have been told you were coming in today. I can have Whitmore pull the current." "Sit down, Harold," she said. He sat. The way he sat, the way the slight performance of ease appeared in his posture, told her he had already done some calculation about what this visit might mean and had chosen a strategy. She put the file on his desk. Not slowly, not dramatically, just put it there. The way you put evidence in front of someone who has already decided they're going to deny everything. "I'm going to tell you what I know," she said. "Not what I suspect. What I know. And then I'm going to ask you one question, and the answer you give me is going to determine how the next part of this goes." Cress looked at the file. He did not open it. "This sounds like an accusation," he said. His voice was even. "Practiced." "It's a statement of facts," she said. "The accusation is Duggan's business, not mine." She sat down across from him, taking the weight off her ankle. "You altered the appraisal valuations on 14 properties in this county over a period of at least 20 months. You manipulated filing dates to shorten the legal response window for affected families. You added fees to loan balances that had no basis in the original agreements and were not disclosed to borrowers." She paused. "You then facilitated the sale of seized properties to Hartwell Cattle at prices below assessed value through Del Stratton in exchange for personal compensation." Cress said nothing. "Whitmore processed the documents," she continued. "Phelps notarized them. But the scheme is yours. The relationship with Stratton is yours. The timing of the acquisitions tracks precisely with your communication with the Hartwell office, which I have obtained through a third party who is not affiliated with this bank." She watched his face. It was good, his face professional and controlled, but not as good as he believed it was. She had been reading faces across desks for 6 years. "My question," she said, "is whether you want to cooperate with the sheriff's investigation, or whether you want to make this difficult." Cress was quiet for a long moment. Then the performance of ease dropped in a single visible instant, like a curtain coming down. What was left underneath it was something harder and colder, and considerably less pleasant. "You were never supposed to be on that road," he said. "The storm was supposed to." He stopped. The room went very quiet. Genevieve felt something move through her chest, a recognition that was colder than anything the mountain had done to her. "The storm was supposed to what?" she said softly. His jaw tightened. He had said more than he intended. That happened to people who had held something for too long, the moment when the pressure found a crack. "You want to talk about cooperation," she said. "Here is the cooperation I am offering you. You tell Duggan everything, Stratton, Whitmore, Phelps, every transaction, every communication, every arrangement. And in return, I don't add to his report the implication that you knew I was traveling that road during that storm." She leaned forward slightly. "Because if you forced me to draw a line between your scheme and my carriage going off Grizzly Crown, Mr. Cress, you will not need a lawyer. You will need a miracle." Cress stared at her. She held his gaze without moving. The clock on his desk ticked through 12 seconds. "Fine," he said. His voice had changed entirely flat, dry, the voice of a man who has made a calculation and doesn't like the result but accepts the arithmetic. "I'll talk to Duggan." Genevieve stood, took her crutch, moved to the door. "Mrs. Lockwood," Cress said behind her. She stopped but didn't turn. "You weren't supposed to survive that," he said. "With you gone, the board would have consolidated. The properties would have transferred without anyone looking too closely." A pause. "I underestimated you." She turned then, looked at him across the office. "Yes," she said. "You did." She opened the door and Duggan came in, and she walked out to the main floor of the bank and told her head teller to open the doors. And the morning business of Copper Hollow came in and found its bank open and its owner standing in the middle of the floor with a crutch and an expression that nobody in that building was going to question today. Ransom found out about Cress from his neighbor 2 days later. The way news traveled in that county not from the official parties involved, but from someone who knew someone who'd seen the sheriff's deputy escorting Cress to the jail. By the time the story reached Ransom, it had acquired several details that were not accurate and had lost several that were, which was how stories always traveled. What was accurate, Cress was in custody. Whitmore had been arrested the same morning. Phelps had reportedly left town the night before Genevieve's visit to the bank, which suggested someone had warned him a detail that was currently giving Duggan a specific kind of headache. Ransom heard all of this and went back to his fence repair. He had wire to run and posts to reset, and the east pasture had been neglected long enough that it needed full attention before the next thaw turned the ground too soft to work properly. Caleb was with him, handing wire and holding the stretcher when needed. They worked together, in the particular silence that fathers and sons develop over years of shared physical work, a silence that was not empty but had things in it. Whole conversations conducted in the angle of a held tool, and the way a man looked at what he'd just built, and decided whether it was good enough. "She's going to give the land back," Caleb said. "Not a question." "She said she's going to try." "Is trying enough?" Ransom tested the tension on the wire. "For Albright, maybe. The deed transferred already. Getting it back is a legal problem." He moved down the fence line. "For the ones where the transfer isn't final, yeah. Trying should be enough." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What about us?" "Our deed didn't transfer. We're fine." "I know. I meant," Caleb stopped, handed his father the next section of wire. "Is she going to keep coming around?" "Genevieve." Ransom was looking at the fence post. "What makes you ask that?" "Because Jonah told her she could come back whenever she wanted, and she said she would." A pause. "And Jonah gets upset when people say things they don't mean." Ransom looked at his son. Caleb was not looking at him. He was looking at the fence, his face careful in the way it was careful when he was working out how to say something that had been sitting with him for a while. "I don't want Jonah to get hurt again," Caleb said. "He's doing better. Since the mountain. Since she was here." He stopped. Started again. "She's not like I thought she'd be. From the bank, I mean. She's not. She doesn't make you feel small." Ransom absorbed this. "No," he said, "she doesn't. But she's also—" Caleb looked at him now. "Papa, she owns a bank. We fix fence." Ransom held his son's gaze for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "We do." It wasn't an answer. Caleb seemed to understand that it wasn't going to be one today, and he nodded and handed his father the wire stretcher. And they went back to work in the silence that had all those things in it. The afternoon sun was going low and flat across the foothills when Ransom finished the last section and stood back and looked at what they'd done. The fence was solid. It would hold. It wasn't beautiful. You could see where the new wire met the old, where the repairs were repairs rather than original work, but it would do the job, and doing the job was what mattered. He loaded the tools into the sled and started back toward the barn, and Caleb walked beside him, and neither of them said anything more about Genevieve Lockwood. But when they got back to the house and Ransom hung his coat and came into the kitchen, he noticed that Jonah had moved the extra chair, the one that had been against the wall, since Clara died, and placed it at the kitchen table, across from where Ransom usually sat. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at that chair for a moment. Then he went to the stove and started supper, and he didn't move the chair. The chair stayed at the kitchen table for 3 days before Genevieve came back. She came in the late afternoon on a Tuesday, driving herself in the small two-wheeled trap she used for short distances. The ankle still wrapped, but bearing more weight than the doctor had authorized. She had a leather satchel across her lap, and the look of a woman who had been working since before dawn and intended to keep working until there was nothing left worth doing that day. Ransom was in the barn when he heard the trap on the road. He came to the barn door and watched her pull up and wrap the reins and climb down with the careful, slightly impatient movement of someone managing a physical limitation while refusing to let it manage them. He stayed in the barn doorway. He didn't go out to meet her. She looked up and saw him. "I need another hour of your time," she called across the yard. "I have the Billings land records, and I can't make sense of the transfer dates without someone who knows the property lines out here." "Come in," he said. She came in. Jonah appeared from somewhere. He had a gift for appearing whenever Genevieve arrived, as if had some internal mechanism calibrated specifically to her presence, and attached himself to her side and walked with her into the house, asking questions about her ankle and whether she had eaten anything and whether she'd seen the new calf that had been born 2 days ago in the east pasture, all in one continuous stream that required no answers because he was going to supply them himself anyway. Genevieve answered him anyway. She always did, with a patience that was not performing itself, not the careful patience of someone trying to be good with children, but the real kind, the kind that came from actually listening. Ransom watched this and went back into the barn and gave them 5 minutes before he followed. The kitchen table had become, over the past week, a working space in a way it hadn't been since Clara was alive and keeping the ranch accounts. Genevieve spread the Billings records across it, and Ransom sat across from her and they worked through the transfer documents the way they'd been working through things all week. She handled the legal language, he handled the land, and between the two of them, they built the picture that neither could have built alone. The Billings records were more damning than the local ones. The Hartwell cattle acquisition timeline showed purchases at prices that, when compared against the actual assessed value of the land, represented discounts of between 30 and 50% on every property. In 2 cases, the transfers had been processed before the legal foreclosure period had fully closed a technical violation that, when combined with the manipulated filing dates, meant those particular properties had been taken in a way that had no legitimate legal standing whatsoever. The Albright deed, Genevieve said, running her finger along a column. The transfer was recorded 3 days before the final redemption period expired. Legally, Gerald Albright still had 3 days to pay. Ransom looked at where she was pointing. He didn't know that. No. Because Kress sent him a notice telling him the period had closed, she sat back. Which means Albright's deed transfer is void. You can get his land back. The bank can pursue it. Yes. Ransom was quiet for a moment. He looked at the records spread across the table, all these documents that represented all these families, these lives, the specific terrible arithmetic of what Kress had done to people who didn't have the means to fight it. The Farrow property, he said. The widow. The title dispute with the adjacent landowner actually worked in her favor without anyone knowing it, Genevieve said. The transaction was never completed. Hartwell's claim is as thin as paper. We file the right motion and she gets it back. She'll need some help rebuilding what she lost, Ransom said. She sold her livestock to try to meet the payments they told her she owed. That money's gone. Genevieve looked at him. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what the situation is. He said it the same way he'd said things to her, on the Mountain Informational, not combative. You said you wanted to understand what you were fixing. I remember what I said. Then you need to understand that giving the Farrow widow her deed back doesn't put 12 head of cattle in her pasture. She's 61 years old. She can work that land if she has animals to work it with. Without them, a deed is just paper. Genevieve was looking at him with that expression. She sometimes got the one he couldn't entirely read, which was unusual because he was generally adequate at reading people. The bank can extend a livestock credit, she said slowly. At terms she can actually manage. Not what Kress was offering, real terms, with a realistic repayment structure tied to her actual production. She paused. I'd need to know what she needs. Specifically. Not what she's willing to ask for, because people in her situation never ask for what they actually need. I can tell you what she needs, Ransom said. I've known Ruth Farrow for 15 years. They looked at each other across the table. All right, Genevieve said. All right, he said. Jonah, who had been sitting in his chair for the past 20 minutes with a piece of paper on which he had been drawing something very seriously, looked up. Are we going to see Mrs. Farrow? Maybe, Ransom said. Jonah went back to his drawing with a satisfied expression. The board meeting happened on a Thursday, 8 days after Kress's arrest, and it was the kind of meeting that Genevieve had been preparing for since the mountain, not in the sense that she'd planned any specific strategy, but in the sense that everything she had learned on that slope, and in the days that followed, had clarified, with considerable force, exactly who she was and what she was willing to accept. Lockwood Mercantile Bank's board consisted of 7 members, 4 of whom had been appointed during her father's tenure, and 3 of whom she had appointed herself. Of the 4 legacy members, 2 had been, she now understood, entirely comfortable with the direction Harold Kress had been taking the institution. Not because they'd known the specifics of the scheme she didn't believe they had, but because the numbers looked good, and the questions the numbers raised were the kind they preferred not to ask. She arrived early and waited at the head of the table. When all 7 were seated, she put the summary document in front of each of them, a 12-page account of Kress's actions, the properties affected, the legal status of each, and the course of action she intended to pursue. She gave them 4 minutes to read it. Then she talked. She talked for 45 minutes without notes, because she knew every figure in that document, and she knew what it meant, and she was not going to perform uncertainty about any of it. She described what Kress had done. She described how long it had been happening. She described the 11 families. She described what she intended to do about it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Board member Aldrich Legacy appointment, always the one who spoke first, cleared his throat. The legal exposure here, he said carefully, is considerable. If we pursue restitution on all 12 properties, we are essentially acknowledging institutional liability for. We have institutional liability, Genevieve said. The question isn't whether we acknowledge it. The question is whether we address it correctly or whether we try to minimize it and get it wrong and end up in a significantly worse position in 2 years when someone who isn't us decides to look closely. The cost is less than the cost of what happens if we don't. She looked at him steadily. I've had the figures run. The property restitution, the livestock credits, the legal fees to pursue the Hartwell transactions, it's recoverable over 4 years at current deposit levels. We are not in danger of insolvency. We are in danger of being an institution that stole from its own borrowers and did nothing about it, which is a different kind of ruin. Aldrich looked at the document in front of him. Then he looked at the man beside him, Pratt, the other legacy member, who had been asking fewer questions than he should have. Something moved between them, the specific communication of two people who have already talked about this in private. The Hartwell pursuit, Pratt said. You're talking about going after a Billings cattle company in a legal proceeding that's going to take years and cost. Del Stratton is already talking to the Billings sheriff, Genevieve said. He started talking the moment he understood that Kress had already talked. The criminal proceeding is Duggan's business and the state's business. The civil recovery is ours. She looked at both of them. And it will succeed. Because the documentation is complete and the transactions were illegal, and we have Kress's full cooperation in exchange for the prosecutor's consideration. Another silence. Board member Hensley, one of her own appointments, a woman who had run a dry goods business for 20 years and understood balance sheets better than anyone else in the room, spoke up. I move that we authorize Mrs. Lockwood to proceed with the restitution program as described, she said, and to pursue the civil recovery action against Hartwell Cattle through appropriate legal counsel. Seconded, said Burroughs, another of her appointments. The vote was 5-2. Aldrich and Pratt voted against and did not look at her when they did it. Genevieve noted this and said nothing about it. There would be a time for that conversation. It was not today. She closed the meeting, thanked the board, and walked out of the building into the cold March air and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, her breath visible, her ankle aching in the way it ached when she'd been sitting too long. Across the street, a man she didn't know tipped his hat as he passed. She nodded back and went to get her trap. Spring came to the Keene Ranch the way spring always came to that part of Montana reluctantly, in fits and starts. A warm week followed by a hard frost, followed by 3 days of mud, followed by something that almost resembled the season it was supposed to be. The creek at the bottom of the east pasture ran high with snowmelt. The calves that had come through the winter looked better than Ransom had expected. The fence line he and Caleb had repaired held through the last of the bad weather. Genevieve came out on a Saturday in late March, with 2 men from Helena, a land attorney named Rourke, and a surveyor his office had contracted, and spent most of the day walking the property lines with Ransom, verifying that everything in the bank's records matched what was actually on the ground. Her ankle had healed to the point where she was walking without the crutch now, still careful on uneven ground, still occasionally putting her weight wrong, and catching herself with the specific expression of someone who is annoyed at their own body. Ransom noticed when it happened and didn't say anything about it. They were standing at the southeast corner of his property, where the terrain rose toward the foothills, and the view opened up across the valley below. When Rourke stepped away to confer with the surveyor, and Genevieve and Ransom were left standing together in the inlet afternoon light, it was the first time in several weeks they had been outside and not actively working on something. Genevieve looked out across the valley. It was a particular kind of afternoon, one of those late winter days that decides to be more generous than it has to be. The air still cold, but the light coming in at an angle that made everything look like it had been restored. The Albrights are moving back next week, she said. I heard. Gerald cried when I told him, she said. He's not a man who does that easily, I don't think. He's not, Ransom said. He shook my hand, and he couldn't say anything for about 30 seconds. She was still looking at the valley. I've closed a lot of transactions in 6 years. Loans funded, debt settled, properties transferred. I've never felt one the way I felt that. Ransom was quiet. I keep thinking, she said, about what would have happened if you'd found your cattle instead of my piece of fabric. If you'd looked at that green strip in the snow and decided it wasn't your business and kept going. She paused. I'd be dead. Kress would still be running that scheme. All 12 of those families would be. She stopped. But that's not what happened, Ransom said. No. So, she looked at him. He was looking out at the valley too, not at her. His profile against the pale sky, looking like what it was a man who worked outdoors his whole life and showed it in every line of his face and didn't seem to be aware of or bothered by that fact. Why did you really not take the reward, she asked. He was quiet for a moment. I told you why. You told me the version of why that fit on a public street, she said. That wasn't all of it. He looked at her then. His gray eyes did the careful thing they did when he was deciding how much of something to say. Because taking a large reward from the bank that was about to take my ranch would have felt like losing something, he said. And I'd already lost enough that year. Genevieve held his gaze. Clara, she said. Yeah, I know a little about losing something and not wanting to lose anything else, she said. After my father died, I held on to that bank like it was the last solid thing. Made every decision like the ground was always about to give way. She paused. Maybe it was. I don't know anymore. But somewhere in the past few months, I stopped feeling like I was holding on and started feeling like I was just doing the work. What changed, he said. She looked at him for a moment. You know what changed? He didn't answer that. But he didn't look away either, which was its own kind of answer. I want to ask you something, she said. All right. The board is going to push back on some of the restitution program. Aldrich and Pratt, they voted against it, and they're going to keep looking for ways to slow it down or reduce the scope. She looked at him steadily. I want to formalize what we've been doing. I want someone whose job it is to understand the realities of working ranches in this county, what the land is actually worth, what a realistic loan structure looks like, what a bad harvest means in practical terms for a family trying to make payments. Not a banker. Someone the ranching community actually trusts. She paused. I want that to be a paid position. Not charity. Real work with real compensation. Ransom looked at her. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you an advisory role. You'd keep the ranch this isn't instead of the ranch. It's in addition to it. 2, maybe 3 days a month in town. More during the periods when we're reviewing applications or handling disputes. She watched his face. It would also mean you'd be in a position to know immediately if anything in that building started going wrong again. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Rourke finished his conference with the surveyor and looked toward them, and then, reading something in the situation, found something else to look at for another few minutes. Caleb wants to expand the cattle operation, Ransom said finally. He's got ideas about it, good ones. He'd need working capital. That's a conversation I could have with him. He's 12. He's 12 now, she said. He won't be 12 when he needs the capital. Ransom looked at the valley again. The light was going lower, doing something orange along the ridgeline to the west. Millie, he said. She wants books, more than what the school has. She talks about a library. Copper Hollow doesn't have a library, Genevieve said. No. Is that a problem I should be interested in? I'm just telling you what she talks about. Genevieve thought about this for a moment. The bank owns a building on 3rd Street that isn't currently tenanted. It's been sitting empty since Kress allowed the previous tenant to default and then never did anything productive with the property. She paused. It's a reasonable size for a reading room, with the right shelving. Ransom looked at her. I'm just telling you what we own, she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth, the almost smile. She had learned it by now the way it appeared, and then was controlled, the way it meant more than it showed. Jonah wants a dog, he said, that I cannot help you with. I know, he said. I'm handling that one myself. They stood there in the fading light for another moment. Below them, the valley was going soft and dim, and the smoke from the ranch house chimney was rising straight up in the still air. And somewhere in the barn Caleb was finishing the evening chores, and this piece of land that had been 3 weeks away from being taken had the specific, unremarkable piece of a place that has been through something and come out the other side of it. Yes, Ransom said. Genevieve looked at him. To the position, he said. Yes. She nodded. No performance about it. Good. They walked back toward the house. The Hartwell cattle situation resolved faster than Genevieve had expected, which she later attributed to Del Stratton's considerable enthusiasm for self-preservation once the Billings proceedings were underway. Stratton gave the state's attorney everything: the timeline of the scheme, the arrangement with Kress, the specific properties targeted, the communication records that established when and how he and Kress had identified the vulnerable ranching families and selected them. He also gave them the name of a 4th person inside the bank, Not a clerk or a notary, but a member of the board itself. Pratt. Genevieve received this information in Duggan's office on a Wednesday morning in April, sitting across from the sheriff and a deputy from the state attorney's office, and she absorbed it with the outward stillness she had developed over 6 years of running an institution where showing too much of what you felt at any given moment was a strategic disadvantage. Inside, she was thinking about a Thursday board meeting, about a man who had voted against the restitution program while knowing exactly what that program was correcting, and who had made that decision while looking at her across a table and saying the word no. When did he know about the scheme? She asked. From the start, near as we can tell, the deputy said. Stratton says Pratt approached Hartwell Cattle originally, before Kress was ever involved. Pratt had been on the board long enough to know which properties were vulnerable, and he had a private investment in Hartwell's expansion. Genevieve looked at Duggan. He's a board member, Duggan said. The arrest is more complicated. He's a private citizen who conspired to defraud borrowers and manipulate bank processes for personal gain, she said. That's not more complicated. No, Duggan agreed. It's not. They arrested Pratt that afternoon. He was at his hardware business when Duggan came in, and he was the kind of man who understood immediately when a situation was over, and he went without theater, which Genevieve was told about secondhand, and found she felt nothing particular about, except a tired, clean kind of relief. The board reconvened the following week with 6 members. Aldrich, the remaining legacy appointee who had voted against the restitution program, came to Genevieve's office the day before the meeting and sat down and put his hat in his lap and said, without any particular introduction, I didn't know about Pratt. Genevieve looked at him. I want you to know that, he said. I voted against the restitution program because I thought it was an overreach and a liability, not because I knew what was underneath it. She studied him for a moment. He was in his 60s. A man who had served on this board since her father's time, who had watched a 34-year-old woman inherit an institution and had managed his skepticism with reasonable professionalism, even when he hadn't managed to hide it entirely. I believe you, she said. He looked slightly surprised. But I need you to understand something, she continued. The reason you didn't know about Pratt is the same reason I didn't know about Kress. We weren't watching closely enough. We were looking at the numbers and not at what was behind them. She held his gaze. That changes now. For both of us. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once slowly, with the gravity of a man acknowledging something he'd rather not, but is too honest to avoid. Agreed, he said. By May, the Keene Ranch had more cattle than it had started the winter with, owing to 2 heifers Genevieve had facilitated from the bank's recovered Hartwell inventory livestock that had originally come from seized properties and had technically reverted to the bank's possession during the legal proceedings. It was not a gift. It was a transaction with terms Ransom had negotiated himself, and the terms were fair, and when the paperwork was signed, he felt nothing except the satisfaction of a fair deal, which was the only kind he was capable of accepting from her. He had been coming to town twice a month, sometimes 3 times. The advisory role had turned out to be less formal than either of them, had quite expected less scheduled meetings and more conversations that happened when he was in town, and a situation came up that required someone who understood both sides of the desk. He had sat in on 2 loan reviews. He had visited 4 ranch properties with Genevieve, and the bank's new loan officer, a woman named Hartman, who Genevieve had hired from a bank in Missoula and who asked better questions than most men Ransom had met. He had written 1 report, with considerable assistance from Caleb, on the realistic impact of winter feed costs on loan repayment timelines, and Genevieve had presented it to the board and referred to it twice in discussions with the state agricultural office. He did not think about what it meant, most of the time. He got up in the morning and worked the ranch, and twice a month he drove to town. It was a life. It was a better life than he'd had in February. What he thought about less successfully was the other thing. He was aware of it. He had been aware of it since sometime in March, though he could not have identified the specific moment, whether it was the afternoon on the hillside, when she'd said, you know what changed, and looked at him with those green eyes that didn't perform anything, or whether it was earlier, the night in the hotel when he'd left her with the crowd and walked to the livery and stood in the dark, thinking about a woman who'd crawled back onto breaking ice to help pull him out of the water when she could have kept going towards safety. He was aware of it and he was doing nothing about it. which was a decision he had made, and was maintaining with the same discipline he applied to the fence line and the cattle counts, and the loan paperwork, the discipline of a man who understood that some things broke when you pushed them before they were ready. Caleb knew. Caleb didn't say anything, but he knew, which Ransom was aware of because Caleb had Clara's eyes and Clara's habit of understanding more than she said. Millie didn't know exactly, but she knew something, which manifested in the way she made sure the house was tidy on the days Genevieve was expected, and the way she had started setting the table for 5 without being asked. Jonah simply assumed it was already settled and was waiting for the adults to figure that out, which was consistent with his general approach to most situations. Genevieve came for supper on a Friday in late May, which had started as a practical thing. They were working through the Faro property documentation and needed the evening hours, and had become, somewhere in the past few weeks, something that looked slightly more like what it actually was. After supper, the children cleared the table in the way the children clear tables when they want to be seen being helpful and also want the adults to have some time without them underfoot slightly faster than normal, slightly louder about going to bed. Ransom and Genevieve sat at the cleared table with their coffee and the Faro documents, which they had already finished reviewing 20 minutes before supper, and both of them knew it. The house was quiet. "Caleb told me today that he wants to talk to you about a cattle expansion plan," Genevieve said. "I know. He's been working on it for 2 weeks. He has the numbers already organized. He brought them to me yesterday when you were in the east pasture." She looked at him. "He's going to be very good at this." "I know," Ransom said. "You should tell him that." "I tell him. Tell him more." He looked at her. "You've known him 3 months." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." He held her gaze. "You do that." "Do what?" "Tell me things anyway, even when it's not your business." "Is that a problem?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." The lamp on the table was burning low. Outside, the May night was doing something soft, the kind of night that comes after a long winter and a hard spring and announces, without making a fuss about it, that things have changed. "Ransom," she said. He looked at her. She didn't look away. She held his gaze with the same steadiness. She held everything not aggressive, not soft, just completely present, the way she had been completely present on that mountain when he'd gone through the ice, and she'd turned around when she could have kept going. "I'm not going to keep coming out here twice a week and pretending it's only about the documents," she said. "That's not fair to either of us." His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was being careful. "Genevieve, I'm not asking you for anything tonight," she said. "I'm just telling you what's true, because I've spent enough time in my life not saying things that were true because the timing wasn't right, or the position was wrong, or it was easier to stay quiet." She paused. "I'm 48 days out from nearly dying on a mountain. I don't have a lot of patience left for not saying things." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she waited, and she was not a person who waited easily, but she waited. "Clara died 11 months ago," he said finally. "I know." I know what it is," she said. "I'm not asking you to be past it. I'm just telling you, I'm not pretending." He looked at the table, then at the lamp, then at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Any of it. But whatever this is, neither do I," she said. "I ran a bank for 6 years. I negotiated with men twice my age who didn't want me at the table. I survived 5 days in a line shack on 2 biscuits. She looked at him with something rueful and entirely genuine. "This is the thing I actually don't know how to do." Something shifted in his face. "That's not reassuring," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." The almost smile appeared. This time, it didn't stop. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her coffee cup, and the lamp burned, and the May night went on outside the window, and neither of them said anything else. But the silence between them had changed into a different kind of silence entirely. The kind that is not empty. The kind that has something new beginning inside it, tentative and unannounced, the way real things begin, not with ceremony, but with 2 people at a kitchen table deciding, without saying it out loud, that they are not going to pretend anymore. The summer that followed was not a quiet one, though not in the way winters in Montana were loud not with emergency or catastrophe, but with the particular noise of things being repaired and rebuilt, and occasionally argued over by people who cared enough about the outcome to argue. The Albright family moved back to their property in the first week of June. Gerald Albright drove the wagon himself, his wife beside him, 4 kids in the back, sitting on the furniture they'd stored at the wife's brother's place for 3 months. Ransom rode out to meet them at the property line, Not because anyone had asked him to, but because Gerald Albright was a neighbor, and that was what neighbors did. He helped unload the wagon, and he didn't say much, and Gerald didn't say much either, and at one point, Gerald stopped in the middle of carrying a chair through the front door and just stood there for a moment, with his hand on the doorframe. And Ransom looked away and gave him the time to do whatever he needed to do without an audience. Ruth Farrow got her deed back in late June, in a proceeding that took less than 40 minutes before a judge in Copper Hollow's small courthouse, because the documentation Genevieve had assembled was, as the judge noted with something approaching admiration, exceptionally complete. Ruth Farrow sat in the courtroom in her good dress with her daughter beside her, and when the judge said the words that confirmed the property was hers, Ruth folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table in front of her for a long moment, and then looked up at Genevieve, who was seated across the room, and nodded once. Genevieve nodded back. The livestock credit had already been arranged. 8 head of good cattle at terms that gave Ruth 5 years to bring the operation back to what it had been. Ransom had helped negotiate the terms, specifically the provision that allowed Ruth to restructure if one of the first 2 seasons ran hard, because he knew what hard seasons did to a repayment schedule, and he knew that a woman of 61 did not have the margin for error that a younger rancher might have. The new loan officer, Hartman, had implemented that provision into 3 other loan structures before the end of the summer, which Genevieve noted in a board report as a best practice, and Ransom read about secondhand from Caleb, who had taken to reading the bank's internal documents with the focused interest of a boy who was already planning ahead several years. Caleb had presented his cattle expansion plan to Genevieve in July. He'd done it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with Ransom sitting to one side not to help. Caleb had been clear about that, but because Caleb wanted him there, which was a different thing. The plan was 8 pages, handwritten, with 2 hand-drawn charts that tracked projected herd growth against projected feed costs over 4 years. The numbers were not perfect. There were 2 assumptions that were optimistic in ways that experience would have corrected, but the structure was sound, and the thinking behind it was genuinely good. Genevieve had asked him 4 questions, hard ones, the kind she would have asked anyone sitting across that desk. Caleb had answered 3 of them well, and been honest about the 4th, said he hadn't thought through that particular scenario, and asked her what she would do about it. She'd told him. He'd taken a note. After he left the table, Genevieve looked at Ransom. 4 years, she said. When he's 16, the capital structure he's proposing would work. The bank could support it if the first 2 years of the existing operation hit his projections. He'll hit them, Ransom said. You're not even a little bit objective about this. No, he agreed. But I'm also right. She had looked at him with that expression he'd come to know well by now, the one that was almost exasperated and almost fond, and landed somewhere in the middle. He asked her in August. Not with planning and not with ceremony, which was consistent with who he was, and which she later said was exactly right, though she did not say it at the time, because she was not immediately capable of organized speech. They had been riding the eastern boundary of his property, something they did occasionally now, not for bank business, but because it was a way to spend time together that felt like itself, rather than a performance of something. The August evening was long and still, the kind that made Montana look like it was making up for the previous winter's behavior. They'd stopped at the top of the low ridge that marked the northeast corner of the property, where the view opened south across the whole valley. It was the same ridge where he'd stood with Caleb in March and looked at the fence and thought about things he hadn't been ready to say yet. He was ready now. He hadn't planned a speech. He didn't have one. What he had was the truth, which was that somewhere between a green strip of fabric frozen in the snow and a May night at a kitchen table, this woman had become the fact around which everything else in his life organized itself, and he was not a man who ignored facts. I want to marry you, he said. Genevieve looked at him. The horses stood in the evening light. Below them, the valley was going warm and gold. That wasn't a question, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. But if you want me to make it one, I will. She looked at the valley for a moment. He watched her face, the way she was doing what she always did when something mattered, which was be completely present with it, not performing a reaction, but actually having one. My life is complicated, she said. I know. The bank, the board, the way people in this town look at the 2 of us when we're together. I know all of that, he said. I've been living in it for 6 months. I'm not asking you because I forgot it was complicated. She looked at him. I have opinions about things. Genevieve, I'm aware. I'm going to keep having them. About the ranch. About your children. About decisions you might think are yours to make alone. Yeah, he said. I expect that. That doesn't bother you. Sometimes it's going to bother me, he said honestly. And sometimes I'm going to be wrong, and you're going to tell me I'm wrong, and I'm going to take longer than I should to admit it. That's probably what this looks like. She studied him. I loved Clara, he said. It was the first time he had said it plainly to her, and he said it plainly on purpose, because it was true and she deserved to know it was true, and it was not a thing that needed to be hidden or apologized for. I'm always going to have loved her. That doesn't go away, and I don't want it to. He looked at Genevieve steadily. But she's gone, and I'm still here, and my children are still here. And you're standing on my land at the end of a day, and it feels like the most natural thing in the world, and I'm 48 years old, and I don't think I get so many things that feel natural that I can afford to walk away from one. Genevieve was very still. Yes, she said. It was quiet on the ridge for a moment. Yes, she said again, differently, not confirming the first yes, but settling into it, the way you settle into something that fits. He reached across and took her hand. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. They sat on the ridge in the August evening and looked at the valley below them, and the horses were patient, and the light went slowly in the way that summer light goes in Montana, reluctantly, making it last, as if it understands that what comes after it is hard and intends to be generous while it can. They married in September, under the cottonwood trees on the north side of the ranch house, with the sheriff and his wife in attendance, and the Albright family, and Ruth Farrow, and her daughter and Hartman from the bank, and a dozen other people from the valley, who had some claim, on this occasion, people whose lives had been touched by the events of the previous winter in ways large and small, people who understood, even if they couldn't have articulated it precisely, that what they were witnessing was not just a wedding, but the conclusion of something that had started in a blizzard and had been working its way toward this point ever since. Caleb stood beside his father. He wore his best shirt, which Genevieve had quietly ensured fit him correctly 2 weeks before the occasion, and he stood with the seriousness that was his natural mode and watched the proceedings with Clara's dark eyes and allowed himself, at the moment when his father and Genevieve said the words that made it official, one small, private smile that he did not try very hard to conceal. Millie cried, which she would later claim was because of the wind, a claim that convinced no one. Jonah did not cry. Jonah stood in the front, closest to the action, with the expression of a person watching an outcome they had anticipated for some time finally arriving. When it was over, he walked directly to Genevieve and took her hand without being invited to, the way he'd done everything from the beginning without preamble, without asking permission, with the complete certainty of a child who knows where he belongs. She held his hand and looked down at him. Hi, he said. Hi, she said. You live here now, he said. I do. He nodded, satisfied, as if this information had confirmed something he'd already filed away as settled, and he was pleased to have the official confirmation. What came after the wedding was not a fairy tale, because the people involved were not fairy tale people, and the life they were building together was not a fairy tale life. It was a real life, with the texture and friction that real lives have. The bank board remained a complicated organism. Aldrich stayed on and proved, over the following year, to be more adaptable than Genevieve had, initially given him credit for not enthusiastic about the new direction exactly, but honest enough to acknowledge when it was working, which was most of the time. She brought 2 new members in the spring, and the balance of the board shifted into something she could work with rather than work around. The civil recovery action against Hartwell Cattle took 14 months and cost more in legal fees than anyone had budgeted, and eventually settled for 60 cents on the dollar, which was not everything, but was considerably more than nothing, and was distributed, with interest, back to the institution's general fund, where it offset a portion of the restitution costs. Del Stratton received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. Harold Kress received a full one. Pratt sold his hardware business to pay legal fees and left Copper Hollow, and nobody who remained seemed to feel the absence particularly. Ransom's advisory role at the bank became, by the second year, something that the institution had organized itself around, in ways that went beyond what either he or Genevieve had initially envisioned. 3 other ranchers from the county had been brought in on an informal basis to provide similar perspective on their respective areas, a structure that Hartman had proposed and that Genevieve had approved, and that Ransom had been quietly advocating for almost since the beginning, though he had advocated for it by pointing out specific gaps and allowing other people to connect the implications. He was good at that. He had always been good at that. He just hadn't until now been in a position where it mattered to anyone beyond his own fence line. The East Pasture fence never gave them trouble again. He and Caleb rebuilt it properly in the spring after the wedding, new wire the whole length, posts set deep. It was the kind of job that took 2 days and did not need to be done again for 20 years, and when they finished it, Caleb stood back and looked at it with the same expression Ransom had always used to look at work that was done right, a quiet satisfaction that didn't need to announce itself. Millie's library happened the following spring. The building on 3rd Street that Genevieve had mentioned under the cottonwood tree on the hillside in March almost casually, almost as if it were an aside, became, with a 6-month renovation funded by a combination of bank property budget and a public subscription that surprised everyone with how quickly it filled, Copper Hollow's first permanent lending library. It opened on a Thursday in April with 47 books, 2 donated reading tables, and a hand-lettered sign above the door that read Copper Hollow Reading Room. Millie was 11 years old, and she stood in the middle of the floor on opening day and turned slowly and looked at the shelves with an expression that her father recognized and that made something move in his chest, the expression of a person who has arrived, without quite being able to explain how, at the place they were always supposed to be. She became the library's unofficial first caretaker, a role that evolved over the following years into something more formal as she grew into it. The reading room grew with her: more books, more tables, eventually a second room. People came from 2 counties over. Jonah got his dog in October, a red cattle dog with 1 blue eye and 1 brown eye, and the personality of an animal that had decided this particular family was correct and intended to apply itself accordingly. He named it Buckle, after the carriage buckle Caleb had found in the snow on the day they'd gone up the mountain looking for lost cattle and found something else entirely. He explained this reasoning to anyone who would listen, which in his experience was most people, because the story of how his family had found Genevieve was the story he told most often and with the most detail, and never exactly the same way twice, because the tales that seemed important shifted depending on the day and the audience. The part that never changed was the ending. He had heard the knocking. He was the one who had heard it first, 3 sounds beneath the wind, and he was the one who had told his father, and that mattered. He understood, in the specific way that children understand things that have changed the shape of their lives, that those 3 sounds were the hinge on which everything had turned. Genevieve thought about this sometimes. She thought about the geometry of it, the chain of small things, each one dependent on the one before. That had to be exactly as it was for any of it to happen. The storm had to carry the fabric precisely far enough downhill to be visible from the trail Ransom walked. Caleb had to be looking in that direction at that moment. Ransom had to be the kind of man who followed a thread without knowing where it led. Jonah had to have the particular quality of stillness and hearing that let him catch 3 sounds in a moment of wind dropping below a hillside shack. Remove any one of those things and she was dead. She had survived, she understood now, not because of anything she was or anything she had built, but because of who happened to be walking that hillside on that morning, a poor man and his 3 children, looking for 2 missing cattle that they never did find, following a green strip of fabric because the alternative was not in Ransom Keene's nature. She had spent 6 years building an institution. She had been good at it. She intended to keep being good at it. But she had learned something on Grizzly Crown Pass that no institution teaches, and no success prepares you for the particular lesson of lying cold and nearly finished in a dark shack and having the thing that saves you be a 6-year-old boy's piece of dried apple offered in an open hand without hesitation or calculation because it was what he had and you needed it. She thought about that lesson when the board got difficult. She thought about it when a loan application came across her desk from a family whose numbers were tight but whose situation was honest. She thought about it when she was tired, when the work was heavy, when the gap between what was right and what was convenient opened up in the way it always eventually did, and asked her which side she intended to stand on. She always knew the answer. She had known it since the mountain. Ransom knew she thought about these things, because she occasionally said some of them out loud on the evenings when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and there was nothing required of either of them except to be present in the same room together. He was not By nature, a man who talked about large things about meaning or lesson or what something had shown him. He dealt in the practical and the immediate and left the philosophical for people who had more time and more words for it. But one evening in the winter of their second year together, she was talking about something the mountain had shown her, and he listened in his way, and then he was quiet for a moment, and he said, "I almost didn't go uphill." She looked at him. "When Caleb found that fabric," he said. "I stood there for maybe a minute, working out whether it made sense, whether I was reading it right, whether it was worth changing our day for a piece of cloth that probably had a simple explanation." He was looking at the fire. "I almost didn't." She was quiet. "I think about that sometimes," he said. Not in a frightening way, just. He stopped. Started again. It's easy to tell a story afterward about how a person would always make the right choice in a given moment. But in the moment, you don't know it's the right choice. You're just a man standing on a hillside in the cold, deciding whether to go uphill or keep walking. Genevieve looked at him for a long time. "What made you go?" she said. He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "My kids were watching," he said. And then, after a pause, and it didn't feel right to walk away. That was all. No more than that. It didn't need to be more. The fire burned. The winter pressed against the windows in the way Montana winters do, with patience and without apology. The way things that have been here longer than any of us press against the small, warm spaces human beings make for themselves. Inside the warm space that this particular family had made, Ransom Keene sat beside the woman he had married and thought about fence lines and cattle and the 40 pages of Caleb's revised expansion plan that were sitting on the kitchen table waiting for his review. Genevieve sat beside the man she had married and thought about the board meeting on Thursday and the new agricultural loan guidelines she was presenting and the look on Ruth Farrow's face in the courtroom the previous summer. Somewhere in the back of the house, Millie was reading past the hour she was supposed to be reading. And Caleb was already asleep because Caleb woke before anyone else and knew it. And Jonah was sleeping with one arm around a red cattle dog, with mismatched eyes, who had decided, on the first night in this house, that Jonah's bed was the correct location and had never reconsidered. Outside, the snow came down steady and quiet, covering the valley, covering the fence lines, covering the ridge where they had stood in August and said what they meant. Far up in the mountains, the pass through Grizzly Crown was closed for winter, as it always was, the road buried under 6 feet of white silence. Nobody searched it. There was nothing up there, now except the mountain itself, the cold and the dark, and the abandoned line shack that was a little more collapsed each spring, returning slowly to the hillside, the way everything eventually returns to the place it came from. The people who had been in that shack were here, down in the valley, in the warm. And that was the whole of the story, except for this. The world is full of people walking hillsides in the cold, carrying the weight of their own losses, looking for whatever it was they set out to find that morning. Most of them will tell you they don't have anything to spare. Most of them are right. But there are moments, cold moments, inconvenient moments, moments when the wind is wrong, the timing is worse, when a person comes across something that asks them to go a little further than they planned to go that day. What Ransom Keene knew, and what his children learned from watching him, and what Genevieve Lockwood carried down from that mountain and never set down again, was this. The answer to that moment is not about heroism. It is not about being the kind of person who does great things. It is about standing on a hillside and deciding that walking away doesn't feel right. That is all it is. That is everything it is.